The prairie never forgot a secret, no matter how carefully it was buried. And on one restless night, beneath a sky cracked open with starlight, a cowboy broke the rule no man dared to touch. He spoke to her. She was the forbidden woman, bound by bloodline and oath, a daughter of the tribe sworn never to mingle with outsiders. Her name was whispered only in warnings. Her presence watched as though she were both flame and shadow. Yet the cowboy, worn from years of dust and silence, crossed that invisible line with a voice that trembled but did not falter. One word to her, and the land itself seemed to shift. She did not answer at first. Her eyes, dark as the midnight earth, searched him with the weight of centuries. She had been told men like him carried ruin in their saddlebags, that his kind took more than they ever gave. And yet, when he spoke, there was no hunger in his words, only truth, raw and unvarnished. For a moment, the world held still, as if even the coyotes silenced their cries to hear what might come next. It was not a kiss, not a touch, but a choice, a conversation forbidden by both their worlds, and therefore more dangerous than any blade. When she finally answered, it was with a voice like smoke, soft but burning. They spoke of loneliness, of scars that never healed, of the weight of carrying names they never asked for. It was a quiet rebellion, two souls daring to meet in the middle of a desert that had always kept them apart. And though the night was silent, the earth felt louder than ever, as if every grain of sand was bearing witness to treachery and tenderness woven into one. But in the Old West, no secret lived through sunrise. As the first light cracked the horizon, hoofbeats thundered in the distance. The cowboy stepped out of the barn, the warmth of her voice still clinging to his chest, only to find the valley alive with warriors. 70 men on horseback, their faces painted, their weapons gleaming in dawn's first fire. They had not come to warn. They had not come to speak. They had come to surround. The cowboy's barn, once nothing more than wood and nails on borrowed land, had become the center of a storm. The price of a single word, spoken to the forbidden woman, had drawn the weight of an entire tribe. And as the sun climbed higher, it became clear this was no longer just a story. It was the story of love defying blood, and the reckoning that would follow at the break of day. The barn stood quiet, but the air around it trembled with tension. Inside, the cowboy leaned against the wooden frame, his revolver resting near the door though his hand never touched it. He knew 70 warriors outside meant death if he made one wrong move. Yet he didn't flinch. He had faced storms, wolves, and men drunk on violence, but never had he stood between his heart and an army. And that was what this moment had become. Not a matter of land or pride, but of a single choice. The words he had spoken to the forbidden woman the night before. She had slipped away before dawn, leaving only the faint scent of sage and the memory of her voice lingering in the air. He didn't know if she had gone willingly, or if her people had dragged her back into their circle. What he did know was that her absence did not erase the truth of what had been spoken. He had crossed into dangerous ground, not with guns or horses, but with honesty. And honesty in the Old West was often more dangerous than steel. Outside, the warriors did not attack. They waited, forming a ring around the barn, their horses stamping the earth, their silence louder than any war cry. It was a warning, but also a judgment. The cowboy understood. They weren't there to kill him outright. They wanted him to surrender, to admit his trespass, to crawl before them, and give up what dignity he had left. And yet, something in his chest refused. He had survived too much to bow now. As the sun climbed higher, shadows stretched across the field, each one reminding him of the odds stacked against him. 70 to 1. Numbers that would break any reasonable man. But reason had left him the moment he heard her speak. That night, her voice had cut through years of loneliness, and he had seen in her eyes the same hunger he carried. Hunger for something more than silence, more than tradition, more than chains. He stepped out of the barn. The door creaked like a final breath, and the ring of warriors tightened. His hands were empty, his hat pulled low, his eyes steady. He did not speak of surrender. He did not speak of defiance. He simply spoke the truth. I will not run. I will not hide. Do what you came for. The silence that followed was not just the pause before violence. It was the pause before history decided which story to tell. The chief rode forward, a figure carved from both authority and sorrow. His feathers caught the wind, his spear glinted in the light, but his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, held more than rage. They held disappointment, betrayal. The cowboy had spoken to the one woman no man outside their bloodline was ever meant to claim. The forbidden woman was not just his daughter. She was the tribe's future, a living bond of promise that could not be broken. And yet, here stood a cowboy who had dared to reach for her voice, as if it belonged to him. "You have crossed the line," the chief said, his voice rolling like thunder across the field. "And lines in this land are written with blood." The warriors shifted, gripping their weapons tighter. The cowboy didn't move. His boots pressed into the dirt, grounding him as though the earth itself had chosen to hold him steady. He answered simply, "I spoke." Nothing more. The chief's lips curled. A word can wound deeper than a blade. He raised his hand, and every warrior behind him leaned forward, ready to strike at a single command. The cowboy looked at them all, then back at the chief. "Then wound me," he said. "But know this, truth doesn't die when you spill blood. It only spreads." His voice was low, but it carried, reaching every ear, every heart within that circle. The forbidden woman stepped into view before the chief could answer. She had not been dragged back. She had not been silenced. She came of her own will, her hair loose, her eyes burning like embers against the dawn. The crowd parted in shock as she walked forward, her steps deliberate, unshaken. She stopped beside the cowboy, her hand brushing against his. Not hidden, not ashamed, but defiant. "He did not steal my voice," she said. "I gave it." The warriors murmured, some with anger, others with awe. The chief's face hardened. He saw not just a man and woman before him, but a challenge to the very order that had bound his people for generations. And in that moment, the choice was no longer his alone. It belonged to every warrior who had heard her words and seen her stand unbroken. The story was shifting, and once told, it could never be untold. The chief's silence stretched long enough for the wind itself to seem restless. Dust lifted in swirls across the field, as if the earth were impatient for an answer. The cowboy stood tall, though his muscles coiled like steel wires beneath his shirt. He had expected death, but he hadn't expected her to stand at his side. That single act turned the balance. Her presence made the standoff more than one man's defiance. It became a question of whether her people would honor her will or erase it. Her words echoed in the stillness. "I gave it." The weight of that confession rippled through the ring of warriors. Many had grown up beside her, knowing her as the woman destined to be guarded, sheltered, and silenced. To hear her speak with such fire unsettled them. Some shifted uneasily in their saddles. Others tightened their grips on weapons, as if afraid of what her courage might awaken in themselves. The chief's eyes burned with conflict. He could order her seized, her words drowned in the dust. Yet doing so meant crushing the very spirit that had made her the pride of the tribe. To let her stand unchallenged, however, meant admitting that tradition was not as unbreakable as he had claimed. His authority trembled in that thin space between action and restraint. The cowboy glanced at her, their shoulders brushing lightly. He saw no fear in her face. Instead, he saw certainty, the kind that doesn't beg but commands. It struck him harder than any bullet could have. He had risked everything to speak to her, but now he realized she was the one risking more. Her defiance cost her blood, her family, her place in the circle. And still, she did not waver. Then the chief spoke, each word sharp as flint. "If you walk with him, you walk away from us." His decree fell heavy, final, a blade drawn in silence. The warriors bowed their heads, but their eyes lingered on her. They waited, not for the chief's command, but for hers. For the first time, the tribe was no longer the only voice in her fate. The dawn bled brighter, painting the horizon in streaks of gold and crimson. The woman looked at her father, her jaw set, her eyes shimmering not with tears, but with unbreakable resolve. She answered, her voice steady enough to cut through the circle. "If I walk away, then perhaps I was never yours to keep." Her words struck like thunder, shaking the silence into pieces. The cowboy felt the air change as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some warriors looked at each other with uncertainty, their belief in unshakable tradition cracked by her courage. The chief's hand tightened around his spear until his knuckles whitened, but he did not raise it. He was not battling a cowboy anymore. He was battling the strength of his own daughter's choice. She stepped forward, closer to the cowboy, and in that movement she drew a line none of them could erase. Her hand slipped fully into his, not trembling, but firm, as if sealing a vow before the world. The cowboy's chest tightened. He had fought men for land, for cattle, for survival, but never had he stood in a battle where the weapon was simply a choice, to stand beside her or to fall alone. And he knew then that his decision had already been made. The circle of warriors stirred, the sound of shifting saddles and rattling weapons breaking the air. Some wanted blood, others hesitation, but none could deny the truth burning in front of them. She had chosen the forbidden path openly, without shame. And in the Old West, courage like that demanded respect, even if it demanded blood as well. The chief lowered his spear, but his voice carried a threat colder than steel. Then so be it. But know this, every step you take from here will be shadowed. Every sunrise will remind you of what you've defied. And one day, the land itself may judge you harsher than I ever could. His words did not quench the fire in her eyes. If anything, they fanned it brighter. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement not of surrender, but of readiness. The barn behind them seemed to fade into shadow as the weight of the chief's decree settled. For most men, exile meant death. For most women, it meant erasure. Yet she stood, her hand locked in the cowboy's, as though she had chosen exile before he ever spoke it. Her people might turn their backs, the land might harden against them, but her choice carried a strength that could not be taken. In that moment, she was no longer the forbidden woman. She was her own. The cowboy's pulse thundered, not from fear but from awe. He had thought himself the one who risked it all by speaking to her, yet he realized now that her courage dwarfed his own. He had gambled with his life. She had gambled with her bloodline. It was not his barn that stood surrounded by 70 warriors. It was her very soul. And still she did not bend. The warriors pulled back slightly, not in retreat, but in uncertainty. Some looked at their chief for direction. Others looked at her with something close to reverence. Tradition had taught them to see her as untouchable, sacred, unreachable. But her defiance revealed a new kind of sacredness, one rooted not in rules, but in truth. And truth, once spoken aloud, is not easily caged again. Daniel, the cowboy, tightened his grip on her hand. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was its own vow, a promise to walk through whatever storm her choice had summoned. He knew that in the Old West, storms did not pass. They lingered, testing every breath until a man either broke or endured. And he was ready to endure. The chief turned his horse sharply, signaling the circle to break. Warriors moved aside, their faces unreadable, their silence heavier than any war cry. The couple stood still as the tribe rode away, the ground trembling beneath the retreating hooves. Yet the threat was clear. This was not an ending. It was only the beginning of a reckoning that would follow them wherever they went. For a long while, the cowboy and the woman remained outside the barn, listening as the last echo of hooves disappeared over the ridge. The silence that followed was deeper than before, like the world itself was holding its breath. She exhaled slowly, her grip loosening but not leaving his hand. "We are no longer theirs," she said softly, her words both a confession and a declaration. The cowboy nodded, though his eyes scanned the horizon. He knew the West did not forgive easily. Revenge could ride in the form of 70 warriors or in the whisper of betrayal from someone unseen. Yet, in her presence, fear dulled. He had lived years as a man marked by survival, never by belonging. But in her, he saw belonging take shape, not as a gift, but as something built by courage. That night, they lit no fire. They ate little. Instead, they sat together beneath the stars, speaking of what might come. She told him of childhood dreams she had buried beneath duty, of how she had longed to walk freely without the weight of her people's expectations. He told her of lonely nights on the trail, where silence was his only companion. By the time dawn returned, they had woven their stories together, no longer his or hers but theirs. The land tested them quickly. By the third day, a dust storm rose from the plains, swallowing the sky in a wall of red. They fought through it side by side, binding cloth across their faces, guiding their horses blindly through the roar. The storm raged for hours, stripping bark from trees and tearing shingles from the barn roof. Yet when it passed, they remained standing, closer than before. It was as though the earth itself had tried to break them, and failed. When the sun returned, golden and relentless, the cowboy looked at her and said, "If this is the life we've chosen, then let the land send its storms. We will not fall." She smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting firelight even without flame. And for the first time, he realized their story was not about surviving exile. It was about creating a life that exile could never erase. Word spread across the plains faster than wind. Travelers carried whispers of the forbidden woman who had chosen the cowboy, and of the 70 warriors who had surrounded his barn only to ride away without bloodshed. Some said the tribe had grown fearful of her spirit. Others claimed the chief was only biding his time. But one truth lingered in every retelling. The bond between them had turned into something larger than defiance. It had become legend. The cowboy knew that legends were as dangerous as bullets. A story could unite, but could also provoke. As he rode beside her across endless stretches of sage and sand, he noticed the way strangers stared, curious and wary. To some, they were a symbol of hope, a reminder that love could defy borders carved in blood. To others, they were a threat, an insult to order, a wound that demanded closure. And in the West, closure often came at the end of a barrel. Still, she did not waver. Each night by the fire, she spoke of freedom with a calm that seemed to silence even the coyotes. She no longer called herself orphan or exile. She simply said, "I am mine." Her words carried weight, and the cowboy found himself listening more than speaking, drawn into the quiet certainty she carried. For a man who had survived years by expecting nothing, it was like drinking water after a lifetime of dust. But danger returned sooner than either of them expected. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, figures emerged from the ridge. Not warriors this time, but armed settlers, their rifles glinting with greed. They accused the cowboy of harboring land that wasn't his, of trespassing where he had no claim. Yet their eyes betrayed their true hunger. They wanted her, the woman whose name had begun to spread like wildfire. They thought taking her would silence the tale. The cowboy stood tall, revolver at his side, but before he could speak, she stepped forward. Her voice cut through the twilight. "You cannot take what does not belong to you, and I do not belong to anyone but myself." The settlers faltered, surprised by the fire in her tone. The cowboy knew then that this battle, like the one before, would not be won with steel. It would be won with the undeniable force of truth spoken aloud. The standoff with the settlers dragged into silence, the kind that carried the weight of decision. Their leader, a grizzled man with eyes like cold iron, sneered at her defiance. "Every soul belongs to someone," he spat, "and those who walk alone are ripe for taking." His words rang hollow, like brittle wood snapping under its own weight. Yet the rifles aimed at them remained steady, waiting for a reason to fire. The cowboy shifted closer, his hand hovering near his weapon. He had fought battles before, but this one was different. This wasn't about land or cattle. It was about dignity, about whether the woman beside him would once again be treated as something to be claimed. He whispered to her, "If it comes to steel, I'll stand." But she shook her head softly. "No, if it comes to truth, we'll stand." She stepped forward again, her voice rising like wind before a storm. "You came with rifles to take me, but look at me. Do I stand bowed? Do I beg? If you take me by force, your rifles will not silence what I am. My story will outlive your bullets." Her words struck with a weight of prophecy. Even the cowboy felt chills run down his spine. The settlers shifted uneasily, for deep down they knew, killing her would not end her. It would only turn her into something even greater. The leader hesitated, his grip faltering. The cowboy seized the moment, his voice calm but cutting. "The land doesn't remember the ones who steal. It remembers the ones who stand." His words echoed her defiance, binding them as one. The settlers, faced with a choice between bloodshed and shame, lowered their rifles slowly. One by one, they turned back toward the ridge, their silence an admission of defeat. When the dust of their retreat settled, She looked at him with steady eyes. "They will keep coming," she said. "Your people, my people, strangers with greed in their hearts. They will keep coming because we dare to speak." The cowboy nodded, his jaw set. "Then let them come. Let them see that some words can't be silenced. Not by 70 warriors, not by rifles, not by fear." And beneath the stars, their story continued, unbroken. The dust storm faded into memory, but its lesson lingered. Each hardship they faced together seemed to carve their bond deeper into the fabric of the land itself. By now, their story had traveled farther than either of them ever rode, passed from trader to traveler, from campfire to saloon. To some, it was a tale of rebellion. To others, it was a warning of what happens when sacred lines are crossed. Yet no matter how it was told, one truth remained unchanged. They had not bowed. The woman felt it too. When she walked into a town, conversations fell silent, eyes followed, and whispers trailed her steps. She was no longer just the forbidden daughter of a tribe. She was something larger, something harder to define. Some feared her, others admired her, but no one dismissed her anymore. And for a woman once called unworthy of even her own people, that recognition was more powerful than any crown. But power carries weight. She began to sense that every choice, every word she spoke, was being measured by unseen hands. Her father's warning echoed in her thoughts. Every step will be shadowed. Perhaps he had been right. Shadows did follow them, strangers who lingered too long, horse tracks that appeared near their camp, eyes in the darkness. The cowboy kept his hand near his revolver more often now, but she knew steel alone could not protect them from what was coming. One night, as the wind howled against their small fire, she told him, "It is not the warriors or the settlers I fear. It is the story itself. Once it grows too large, it stops belonging to us." He listened in silence, knowing her words were true. In the West, stories lived longer than the men and women who birthed them. And once released, they belonged to everyone, friends, enemies, and even the land. Yet even in her fear, there was strength. She no longer doubted her path. She knew the risk, and she embraced it. "If the story outlives us," she said softly, "then let it carry the truth that we stood." The reckoning came at dawn, as it always seemed to in the West. A group of riders appeared on the horizon. Not settlers this time, nor her father's warriors, but a mix of both. Men who once would have never ridden side by side now shared a cause, to silence the story before it swallowed them all. Their torches burned against the pale sky, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. The cowboy and the woman stood outside their cabin, side by side. He loaded his revolver, each click echoing like a prayer. She held no weapon, but her presence was sharper than any blade. Together they watched as the riders drew closer, dust boiling behind them. It was not fear that filled the air, it was inevitability. This was the price of choices made beneath the stars, of words spoken in defiance of law and blood. But something unexpected happened. As the riders closed in, some slowed. Their torches wavered. For every man who glared with hatred, another hesitated, remembering the story not as a threat but as a promise. The forbidden woman's defiance had already reached their ears, and now they saw her with their own eyes, unbroken, unashamed, standing beside the cowboy as though she had been carved into the earth itself. The leader barked an order, demanding they burn the cabin, scatter the couple, erase their defiance. But not every man obeyed. Some lowered their torches, others turned their horses aside. Division cracked through their ranks like lightning, splitting the sky. And in that moment, the cowboy and the woman understood. They had already won. Not through gunfire, not through blood, but through the undeniable power of choosing to stand. The riders who remained turned back into the horizon, their torches shrinking into the distance. The land fell silent again, save for the cry of a lone hawk overhead. The cowboy glanced at her, and she met his gaze with a small, knowing smile. They were still hunted, still exiled, still alone. But their story had grown stronger than steel, stronger than fear, stronger than any army of 70 men. And in the Old West, that kind of story could never be killed. The story of the cowboy and the forbidden woman was never about barns, tribes, or even the 70 warriors who once surrounded them at dawn. It was about the courage to speak when silence is demanded, and the strength to stand when the world insists you fall. Their defiance carved a scar across the Old West, one that could not be hidden by dust or erased by time. And in that scar lay a truth deeper than blood. Love, when chosen with conviction, can rewrite the laws of men. Through storms, exile, and the weight of shadows, they never surrendered their choice. They learned that survival is not merely about enduring. It is about refusing to let others dictate the worth of your heart. Every step they took away from tradition became a step towards something larger, a future unbound, a path carved by their own will. And though enemies rose against them, the story of their defiance rose faster, spreading beyond their reach, ensuring that their voices lived where their bodies could not. The forbidden woman transformed into something her people never expected, a beacon of freedom. The cowboy, once marked by loneliness, found in her not rescue, but belonging. Together, they showed the world that exile is not the end, but the beginning of a different kind of strength. They were hunted, doubted, and betrayed, yet through it all, they stood. And because they stood, their story now belongs to us. When you reflect on their journey, remember that the greatest battles are not fought with steel, but with choice. Choosing to speak, choosing to stand, choosing to love against all odds. That is the legacy they leave, a reminder that even in the harshest lands, the human spirit can burn brighter than fear, and that no number of warriors can surround a heart that refuses to bow. If this story moved you, let its echo continue. Subscribe to the channel to keep walking through tales that remind us of the strength hidden in silence and the fire born in exile. Leave a like if their courage stirred something inside you, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because stories like this live longer when they are remembered, retold, and carried forward, not as legends of the past, but as truths for the present.